Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another edition of The Democratic View. And I'm the hostess. My name is Phyllis Italiano. And these days we have a very prominent issue in our town and in our village, and that is the PSEG polls. And there is a group called Save East Hampton, and one of its terrific proponents is a man who's with us today, and his name is Jeremy Samuelson, and we all know him. How are you, Jeremy?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm good. I'm a little disturbed, though, I must admit. I have, as I told you before, I couldn't find McGurk Street for a while. And then when I did, I was absolutely shocked by the vision of those poles and the wires. Yeah. It's amazing to see that all that high voltage electricity will be going through this beautiful, almost movie set street of lovely little houses that make up our wonderful village. And it's really appalling. So give us some background on how this all came about.
So LIPA at the time, Long Island Power Authority, over the last several years has been looking at plans for, in their description, expanding the power supply to Long Island. And a component of that was a plan for East Hampton. Now, unfortunately, where most of these things go off track is pretty early on when the folks who are attempting to design a solution to a perceived problem fail to consult with the local community. And as I said, this one was no exception. It went off track in exactly that same respect. So that when you fast forward to not quite, the middle or the end, or rather the fall of last year, 2013, what we had was LIPA's replacement, which is called PSEG, come in and say, okay, here's what we're going to do, and we need the permits, and we're just going to go ahead and go through the motions here. Unfortunately, what PSEG, as Governor Cuomo's handpicked replacement for LIPA, didn't do was really go through the standard open public process where everyone knows what's going on, everyone sees what the plans are, there's a public forum that's held at Town Hall. Instead, they did the bare minimum, and unfortunately, because this was such a closed process, people who eventually figured out what was going on here, didn't object within the standard statute of limitations that applies here. So, big transmission line upgrade, to hear them describe it, where they're taking existing poles that have been in place for some number of years that have what's referred to as a 13 kV or 13 kilovolt distribution line on them, and they're now saying, okay, well, because this historic infrastructure was here, we're now going to supersize this. We're going to take those poles out, we're going to put in much larger poles, and rather than having this be a neighborhood scale and appropriate size distribution system, we're now going to transition this to a transmission system that has the capacity to go up to 33 kilovolts. So you have basically one line that is designed for the neighborhood that it goes through that is, again, 13 kilovolts, where this is, you drive down the street, you have a pole, line leaves that pole, goes to somebody's house, and that's how I get my electricity supply. That's distribution. What we're being asked to go along with now is transmission. So what that means is now in my front yard, and it's sort of at one end of my property and at the other end of my property, we have two much larger poles, which is an issue in and of itself, but those poles no longer are intended for electricity that benefits this neighborhood directly. Instead, the power company has told us, well, you're our new superhighway for electricity transmission. So we, ironically, don't even get a direct benefit from this thing, but it's going in our front yards through East Hampton Village and East Hampton Town. It runs approximately 6 miles. So the poles are taller, the electricity transmission is much taller, and we still have our 13 kilovolt line at the bottom of it, which we all need, and that's great. But basically now we're being asked to live with all of the impacts of having these much taller poles, which are much heavier, and while they're rated to 130 miles per hour, really don't get us over to what the utility providers tell us they want to do, which is a more resilient system. Sorry to keep talking, but what do they mean by that? What is resiliency? Well, Hurricane Sandy is a perfectly good example for us. We have thousands and thousands of miles of electricity transmission lines in Suffolk County. And we had a chance to pose the question to PSEG and their representatives saying, okay, well, there's 2 ways you could do this. You can run the lines underground, which is what the rest of the industrialized world does, or you can run them above ground, which is what the rest of the industrialized world did, up until about 60 years ago, and then they realized that their costs over time are tremendously higher. There's health concerns, so hey, let's do the right thing and put them underground. We never accepted that lesson. So PSEG now comes to us and says, well, in order to have redundancy and resiliency and be more prepared for the next storm, we're going to duplicate a line that now runs along the Long Island Railroad, and we're going to make this big transition line on these big sturdy poles that, trust us, don't worry about it. They're 65 feet tall and 20 feet from your home, but they'll never come down in a storm. So we had a chance to ask PSEG the question, well, when Hurricane Sandy came through here, how many of the 1,000+ miles of below ground line, buried line that you have now, did you have to repair? And the answer was 0. How many miles of the over 1,000 miles of above ground line did you have to repair? And the answer was hundreds and hundreds. So, we're being told that this is a project that is needed because we need additional resiliency. And my response to that is to say, well, okay, if we want to build a resilient system, let's build a resilient system. Let's do what the rest of the world does, and let's go ahead and put the lie to the idea that this thing costs more. In fact, no, it doesn't. When you have to send all of these trucks out after every storm and mobilize guys from Pennsylvania and New Hampshire and Kentucky to come here, and right. When we don't have electricity, to fix lines that are above ground for weeks on end, when we largely could have avoided that crisis by paying them more money up front to bury them and then have them in place for between 20 and 30 years. Maintenance is required, of course, but what you don't have is the problem that we have now, which is 2/3 of all outages nationally, but this also bears out regionally and locally, are caused by falling limbs on lines. So if we could eliminate 2/3 of our problem and put a significant dent in eliminating our maintenance budget over time by burying these things, why wouldn't we? And the answer is, of course, because PSEG in this particular instance, it's not a public utility. They're not here to do what's best for you or what's best for me. They're a private company. And so when they do these dollars and cents analyses of, what makes sense, they're doing it with an eye towards making sure that there's enough money left on the table within a 1-year, 3-year, or 5-year period to pay their shareholders handsomely. So our property values, our health, the look of our community, all of these things are basically being violated in the name of shareholder profit rather than either resiliency or good community planning or human health or environmental health. And that's a travesty.
I have about 100 questions on all the things you just said. So I'm going to start with the fact that that LIPA did a, I'm going to say show, because it was on LTV, and you can see it every once in a while. They do re-show that, about their system. And it was before Sandy. So it's a couple of years old, but they did it at Bridgehampton Library, and it was all about what they do when there's a storm. And there were 2 guys who were running this. And the basic thing is that they define themselves as an overhead power company. They do not ever think about burying the lines. And as you say, The lines are buried in practically all of Europe. Now, that is really outrageous that the United States has not been able to cross that threshold. What are we thinking? When they have to, and they were talking about, well, the reason it takes so long for the power to come back on after a big storm is because we have to get trucks from here and there and all over the country. And it's like, wait a minute. It takes 7 days because you're getting a truck from Texas?
Right.
And how many storms, and I wrote them down at one point because I'm a Fire Islander, and I know how many times I was evacuated, and I know how many times there was storms out here that, sent the power to the ground. How many times do you do that before you wake up and say, hey, maybe we should start doing something else, like burying lines? You walk down any street, I live in Springs, you look around, there's nothing but trees. So all those lines are really in jeopardy. And you're going to constantly be fixing them all the time. So you have to wonder what these people think and who's running this. And I want you to tell me the difference between a public utility and a private corporation. I mean, I know what a private corporation is, but give me an example of a real utility.
Yeah, so just a quick thought on something you were saying a second ago. We have legitimate frustrations with this private utility and how they decide to make these decisions, but as is often the case here, we're all a little bit guilty and a little bit to blame, and there's two ways that I would describe that to you. The first one is that the reality is that when these trucks come in from far away to help us get back on our feet after a major storm, that's usually federal dollars that are getting paid to support that work. So we've created a business model, whether it is a public utility or whether it is a private company, where we say, okay, do me a favor, please cut corners on the front end and supposedly reduce costs by having this thing above ground. And then the maintenance that we all know is going to come but don't plan for, that comes out of some magic pile of money somewhere. We're all grumpy all the time about how big is the budget and the deficit and why do we spend money on these things when we should be spending them on those things. Whatever your point of view, the bottom line reality is that we've created a system where we've incentivized both public utilities and private corporations who do this utility work to make sure that basically part of their profit is dependent upon storms coming through, knocking these things down, and then getting federal reimbursements, often through the states, for the work. So we've actually created a model that is dependent on having this backward view of the universe that doesn't do what I would argue is a very sensible thing. And what I mean by that is, well, okay, if we took, let's say it's double the money, which it isn't, but if we took double the money to bury these things on the front end and then radically reduced maintenance costs over time, just maintenance, not even catastrophic events, but just simple maintenance. Okay, so you radically reduce maintenance costs over time and you don't quite get back to a full capture of your initial capital outlay for burying the line, and you say, okay, well, how am I going to justify this? Well, how you're going to justify it is by the elimination of all that unanticipated, or I should say unbudgeted, spending that we know the federal government quite often is, via a disaster declaration, going to come back in and reimburse us for. So these guys say, well, that's part of my business model. So not only am I saving money on the front end here in terms of doing the lower cost projects, so whether that's money that I hang on to for my budget or money that I can then pass through to my shareholders from my ratepayers, the people who theoretically I'm here to provide for, we now take that money and say, okay, well, I'll spend less on the front end. I'll skip the oil change, basically. And instead of doing the right thing, instead of adopting best practices, I'm going to pretend that really saves me money over time because I'm going to ignore the true costs of actually operating in this way. And that's a problem. So you asked me a different question, though, about the distinctions between public utilities and private corporations. So while I'm certainly not an expert in these things, I can just point out a couple of pieces of the puzzle for you. Look, I don't think there was a lot of people lining up before Hurricane Sandy to say, we love LIPA. I mean, it's just not the nature of, how utilities operate. We go home and, the power's shorted out during the day. Now I got to reprogram everything in the house and, reboot the router, and maybe it blew out my hard drive or something. So, nobody ever calls a utility company and says, hey, thanks, you guys did great today and I didn't have any problems. So, I get it. They feel unloved. But so LIPA came to this party, after LOCO went down in a wreck,
Right.
and then we had National Grid, and then we get LIPA. And so there seems to be this game of musical chairs that says, as long as every couple of years we change the name of this thing and, we give them a new brand, then we've got a fresh crack at people doing what they'll never do, which is love your utility. So, all right, LIPA's standing there, Hurricane Sandy comes through. And folks who had a long-standing agenda of not liking LIPA for a whole host of reasons, very powerful people, including Governor Andrew Cuomo, took a look at this and decided not to let a good crisis go to waste, because of course there's opportunity in crisis. And so all of this pent-up desire to take LIPA and throttle it on the part of the governor in particular got transitioned into a really bold move that didn't, I would argue, receive as much understanding or attention from the public, particularly just Joe ratepayer like myself, who really didn't understand, because this thing happened so quickly with executive orders and all of that, that what we were getting was a public utility which, at least on the face of it, was intended not to pass money through to shareholders, but was intended to be a publicly supported enterprise where people had an opportunity to, address their concerns to the agency, had more of an ability to seek redress for various grievances that they had. Those things are part and parcel usually to the very structuring of a utility.
And that was LIPA.
And that was LIPA. And look, nobody's going to say LIPA was perfect, but it had some of those elements of a public utility that one could say with a straight face, at least gave people an opportunity to interact with an agency that theoretically was there to provide service to the people. And so what the governor did in the wake of Hurricane Sandy was seize upon the opportunity to say, look, LIPA really did a poor job during Hurricane Sandy. They had all of these outages. They didn't live up to their charge. So I'm going to offer a radical solution, and that is to essentially shutter the public utility and to bring in a private organization, a privately held company that has shareholders from New Jersey, which is growing and growing and growing, to be more of a regional player, and bring them to Long Island to create a Long Island-focused subsidiary, which will basically get handed all of the plans that are already on the shelf for future grid expansion, won't have some of those additional benefits of a public utility, will have the competing interest of using the ratepayers' money to provide service to the ratepayer while simultaneously trying to make sure that shareholders at the end of the equation get enough money for them to feel like they're getting their value out of it. So we really changed, and I don't want to say we, because it wasn't me, it wasn't you. The governor, decided for a series of reasons that I don't understand.
I do.
Do you? Please. What do you got?
Well, I think the governor is, if you listen to all of the commercials about New York State, he's interested in developing and having businesses. Look at Riverhead. You see how Riverhead is developed? How many things are there now? I mean, I remember Riverhead in the 50s when I was a mere slip of a girl, and it was nothing. And you look at Riverhead now, it's beginning to look like Manhattan, with all of those big stores, at least like Westchester County. And I think that's his goal. I think his goal is to make the East End, where there's a lot of money, a lot of people with a lot of money, and bring all of that kind of business and development here, which, of course, is the thing I don't want, but that's what I think is his ulterior goal. It certainly isn't to get votes, because he's not going to get any votes from here. And he is up for a re-election now. As a matter of fact, I do want to tell people that one of the things they have to do is they have to let the governor know how they feel about this. Take a drive down. Well, you can do it even on Cedar, and then I'll turn around into the name of that other street that leads into McGurk by the...
Cheryl?
Yeah, whatever the street
Cooper?
is, Cooper,
Yeah.
whatever that one is that leads right into it, and you see those poles. But when you see them next to the houses is when it really, next to the big building of the fire department, it's not quite as obscene. It is obscene still. But when you see it on the street, it's really horrible. And I want people to go there, and I want them to make sure they write to the governor and tell him, we don't want this kind of thing. So that's what I think is his motive. I think it's to develop the east end of Long Island so that we lose our rural character and just become Nassau County, which I'm sure puts a lot of money, tax money, into the coffers of New York State.
Well, I remember hearing both our Assemblyman Fred Thiel and our State Senator Ken LaValle at the time that it was still a proposal to bring in PSEG. I remember both of them stating very clearly that they felt like this was a big mistake, that we absolutely shouldn't go down this road, that the public would not be best served under this model. And I follow a lot of the issues that these guys are working on, but I'll fully admit that I heard everything they said in those presentations, and I didn't appreciate fully the extent to which they had already identified an issue that we were really going to be forced to live with and, frankly, not have appropriate redress from going forward. So there's a part of me, as happens often, that wishes I could go back and whisper in the ear of myself on that day and say, what those guys are talking about, you really need to listen to this and you need to understand it more fully. And even if you talk to people who have law degrees and work on these issues and you say, okay, so because LIPA still exists, explain to me the relationship between LIPA now, it's just kind of a holding corporation that PSEG went under, and how does all of that work?
Me too, I want to know.
Well, I don't know. There's really smart people who, as I said, work exactly on these issues that say, either I don't know, or it's unclear, or that's still kind of being figured out, and I think that's really a problem. It should be more transparent than that. You should know when there's a problem, how do you address that problem? And if PSEG were here, they'd say, well, here's my 1-800 number, call me. And you say, okay, well, we've met with you guys a couple of times now, and all you've done is say, yes, 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 and pat us on the head. But has anything changed as a result of these very real concerns that we've raised with you? No. It took our town supervisor and town board just a week ago now having the courage to stand up and really get inside the nuts and bolts of this to find a chink in the armor and say, hang on, there's an element of our local building and zoning code here that requires this work that happens to plug this thing in to one of the substations, in this case in Amagansett, that you guys should have come before us, and you should have gotten a building permit, you should have had site plan review, you should have been before the architectural review board. And so, look, if we were a year ago in time and we didn't have that statute of limitations problem, I think we'd have a pretty clear-cut case where, a judge, regardless of sort of disposition, would have to look at this and say, this is pretty bad. But the statute of limitations did close, and so we're all forced to look for other ways to push back.
So what is the statute of limitation? What exactly does that mean? Explain that to me if you can.
So under state law, State Environmental Quality Review Act, basically somebody has to be the lead agent for an application to do a certain type of expansion, in this case a utility expansion. And so there's all kinds of paperwork that has to happen as a result of this decision tree that sort of unfolds. It's, okay, answer this question, if yes, go this way, if no, go that way. And what you quickly find with these large-scale utility projects is that they're handled a little bit differently than just somebody who wants to build a deck on the back of their house. And that makes sense. But unfortunately, one of the things that's happened over time is that utilities kind of got a special carve-out where they said you can't look as closely at these as you would at some other development applications because there's an underlying assumption that there's a public interest that's being served here by providing utility capacity, whether that's water or electrical or whatever. And that may be a fair assumption, but what it doesn't do is it doesn't require, or excuse me, it doesn't remove the need for an environmental review under this State Environmental Quality Review Act. And so there were a series of decisions that were made, a series of paperwork that was filed that were really erroneous. And there are parts in there where you read them now and you just say, holy cow, these guys didn't get it. Now, why didn't we catch that? Well, because this being slightly hyperbolic here, a lot of this happened in a way that it wasn't done in the light of day. You know, okay, there was a meeting with 6 people that was held at the Village Emergency Services Building in September of last year. A minority of this project is in the village. A majority of this project is in the town. Town residents, and I'm one of them who should have been notified, were never notified. So now PSEG is standing there with LIPA's homework from the seeker review process saying, hey, we checked all the boxes. Well, no, you didn't, but our ability to blow the whistle and get some redress here from a court, which I think would have been very straightforward, and I've done enough of these that, you know, seemed straightforward and weren't, so I have an ability to differentiate. You know, this review process that should have been very straightforward, and then the ability to appeal that review process, which would have been, you know, I hate to sound like George Tenet, but a slam dunk. Frankly, we got time barred on it because there's 120 days within which you have to appeal this thing. And rather conveniently, PSEG has decided to wait until essentially that full 120 days for an appeal ran out before they then really got serious about doing the work. So by the time you saw the pole going up in your front yard, the window had already closed.
You know what also gets me about those poles in the front yard? I'm thinking to myself, what does that do to the value of that house? Would you be able to sell that house? Will you be able to get another mortgage on that house? Or is your property now worth nothing? That's a question.
It's a really important question, and I don't know the answer to it, but what I can tell you is that there are very real and very specific concerns about people's ability to get financing, to get competitive financing, to get federal home loan guarantees, that folks who are a lot smarter than I am are looking into those very issues right now.
Well, that's very outrageous. I mean, that is really outrageous that those people should be stripped of their property value completely. And I think that's what it is, because I certainly wouldn't buy a house on that street. Why would I?
Well, and the people who've invested there, whether it was 40 years ago or whether it was 4 years ago, right, those people are subsidizing the work that, frankly, benefits the entire rate base here.
Right.
So make up a number. Whatever X is, I just took that amount of a hit, and I'm paying for it rather than PSEG.
Well, here's the things, folks. You've seen the website over there. You've got to write to the governor. We've got to stop this. Thank you very much, Jeremy. I think you have kind of got the tip of this iceberg with all of your explanations, because I still have some other questions, but we'll have to do that another time. But anyway, folks, you know what you got to do. Let the governor know how you feel. The man is up for re-election, and that seems to be the key word for politicians these days.